Part 14 of The Sunflower. We pick up the story where Simon Wiesenthal is speaking to his friend Bolek, who had, before he was in the camp, been training as a Catholic priest. And Simon said, "So he asked something from me that was impossible for me to grant." He was talking about the SS officer's confession. "Probably," said Bolek, "he turned to you because he regarded Jews as a single condemned community. For him, you were a member of this community, and thus his last chance." What Bolek was saying reminded me of the feeling I experienced during the dying man's confession. At that time, I really was his last chance of receiving any absolution. I had tried to express this view when discussing the affair with Josek, but he managed to convince me otherwise at the time. Or was it an illusion? But Bolek continued, "I don't think he was lying to you. When one is face to face with death, one doesn't lie. On his deathbed, he apparently returned to the faith of his childhood, and he died in peace because you listened to his confession. It was a real confession for him, even without a priest. Through his confession, as you surely know, though it was not a formal confession, his conscience was liberated and he died in peace because you had listened to him. He had regained his faith. He had become once again the boy who, as you said, was in close relationship with his church. You seemed to be all on his side," I protested. "Very few SS men were brought up as atheists, but none retained any teaching of their church." That's not the question, I thought. I thought a lot about this problem, and when I was in Auschwitz, I argued with the Jews there, and if I survive this camp and ever get ordained a priest, then I must reconsider what I have said about Jews. You're aware that the Polish church in particular was always very anti-Semitic. But let us stick to the problem, said Bolek. So this Lemberg fellow showed signs of repentance, genuine, sincere repentance for his misdeeds. That at least is how you described it. Yes, I answered. I'm still convinced of that. Then Bolek pronounced solemnly, then he deserved the mercy of forgiveness. But who was to forgive him? Nobody had empowered me to do so. You forget one thing, said Bolek. This man had not enough time left to atone for his crime. He had no opportunity to expiate the sins which he had committed. Maybe, but he had come to the right person. Had he done so? I had no power to forgive him in the name of other people. What was he hoping to get from me? Without hesitation, Bolek replied, in our religion, repentance is the most important element in seeking forgiveness, and he certainly repented. You ought to have thought of something. Here was a dying man, and you failed to grant his last request. That's what's worrying me. But there are requests that one simply cannot grant. I admit that. I had some pity for this fellow, though. We talked for a long time, but came to no conclusion. On the contrary, Bolek began to falter in his original opinion that I ought to have forgiven this dying man. And for my part, I became less and less certain as to whether I had acted properly. Nevertheless, the talk was rewarding for both of us. He, a candidate for the Catholic priesthood, and I, a Jew, had exposed our arguments to each other, and each had a better understanding of the other's views. When at last the hour of freedom struck, it was too late for so many of us. But the survivors made their way homeward in groups, and Bolek too went home, and 2 years later I heard that he had been ill, but I never learned what happened to him eventually. For me, there was no home to return to. Poland was a cemetery, and if I were to make a new life, I couldn't start in a cemetery where every tree, every stone reminded me of the tragedy which I had barely survived. nor did I want to meet those who bore the guilt of our suffering. So soon after liberation, I joined a commission for the investigation of Nazi crimes. Years of suffering had inflicted deep wounds on my faith that justice had ever existed in the world. It was simply for me to restart my life from the point at which it had been ruthlessly disrupted. I thought the work of the commission might help me regain my faith in humanity and in the things which mankind needs in life besides the material. In the summer of 1946, I went on a journey with my wife and a few friends to the neighbourhood of Linz. We spread a rug on the hillside and looked out on the sunny landscape. I borrowed a pair of binoculars and studied nature through them. Thus, at last, I could reach with my eyes objects to which my weak legs could never carry me. As I looked around, I suddenly saw behind me a bush, and behind the bush, a sunflower. I stood up and went slowly towards it. As I approached it, I saw other sunflowers were growing nearby, and at once I became lost in thought. I remembered the soldiers' cemetery at Lemberg, the hospital and the dead SS man on whose grave a sunflower could now be growing. When I returned, my friends looked at me anxiously. "Why are you so pale?" they asked. I didn't want to tell them about the haunting episode of the hospital in Lemberg. It was a long time since I had thought about it, yet a sunflower had come to remind me of what I anything to reproach myself for. As I recalled once more the details of the strange encounter, I thought how lovingly he had spoken of his mother. I even remembered her name and address, which appeared on the bundle containing his possessions. A fortnight later, on my way to Munich, I took the opportunity to pay a visit to Stuttgart. I wanted to see the SSS man's mother. If I talked with her, perhaps it would give me a clearer picture of his personality. It was not curiosity that inspired me, but a vague feeling of duty, and perhaps the hope of exercising forever one of the most unpleasant experiences of my life. At that time, the world was seeking for a more precise understanding of Nazi atrocities. What at first nobody could believe, chiefly because the mind could not comprehend the enormity of it, slowly became authenticated by fresh evidence. It gradually dawned that the Nazis committed crimes which were so monstrous and so incredible. But ere long, priests, philanthropists, philosophers implored the world to forgive the Nazis. Most of these altruists had probably never even had their ears boxed, but nevertheless found compassion for the murders of innocent millions. The priests said indeed that the criminals would have to appear before the divine judge, and that we could therefore dispense with early verdicts against them, which eminently suited the Nazis' book. Since they did not believe in God, they were not afraid of divine judgment. It was only earthly justice that they feared. Stuttgart, I found, was one great big ruin. Rubble was everywhere, and people were living in cellars and bombed-out houses, merely to have a roof over their heads. I remembered Kristallnacht, when all the burning of books and synagogues took place. And somebody had said, "Today they burn down the synagogues, but one day their own homes will be reduced to rubble and ashes." On columns and walls, I saw notices posted by families who had been torn apart and were seeking to find each other again. Parents were looking for their children, and children were looking for their parents. I inquired for the street in which the SS man's mother was supposed to be living. I was told that this part of the city had been devastated by the bombs and the inhabitants had been evacuated. As there was no public transport, I set out on foot to pursue my quest. Finally, I stood outside an almost completely destroyed house in which only the lower floors seemed to be partly inhabitable. I climbed the decrepit, dusty stairs and knocked on the shattered wooden door. There was no immediate response. I prepared myself for disappointment of an unfulfilled mission. Suddenly the door opened gratingly and a small, frail old lady appeared in the threshold. "Are you Frau Maria?" I asked. "Yes," she answered. "May I speak with you and your husband?" "I'm a widow," she replied. But she bade me to come in, and I looked around the room, the walls of which were cracked and the plaster on the ceiling was loose. Over the sideboard hung, not quite straight, a photograph of a good-looking, bright-eyed boy. Around one corner of the picture there was a black band. I had no doubt this was the photograph of the man who had sought my forgiveness. He was an only son. I went over to the photograph and I looked at the eyes that I had never seen. "That is my son Carl," said the woman in a broken voice. "He was killed in the war." "I know," I murmured. I had not yet told her why I had come. Indeed, I had not yet made up my mind what I wanted to say. On the way to Stuttgart, many thoughts had run through my head. Originally, I had wanted to talk to the mother to check the truth of the story he had told me. But was I secretly hoping that I might hear something that contradicted it? It would certainly make things easier for me. The feeling of sympathy which I could not reject would then perhaps disappear. I reproached myself for not having planned to open the conversation. Now that I had confronted the mother, I didn't know how to begin. I stood in front of Carl's portrait in silence. I could not take my eyes off him. His mother noticed. He was my only son. Oh dear, a dear good boy. So many young men of his age are dead. What can one do? There is so much pain and suffering today, and I'm left alone. Many mothers had also been left alone, I thought. She invited me to sit down. I looked at her grief-stricken face and said, "I'm bringing you greetings from your son." "Is this really true? Did you know him? It is almost 4 years since he died. I got the news from the hospital. They sent his things back home to me." She stood up and opened an old chest from which she took the very small bundle the hospital nurse had tried to give me. "I have kept his things here, his watch, his notebook, and a few other trifles. Tell me, when did you see him?" I hesitated. I didn't want to destroy the woman's memory of her good son. 4 years ago, I was working on the Eastern Railway at Lemberg, I began. One day, while we were working there, a hospital train drew up, bringing wounded from the East. We talked to some of them through the window. One of them handed me a note with your address on it and asked me to convey to you greetings from one of his comrades, if ever I had the opportunity to do so. I was rather pleased with this quick improvisation. "So actually, you never saw him?" she asked. "No," I answered. "He was probably so badly wounded that he could not come to the window." "How then was he able to write?" she questioned. His eyes were injured, and all the letters he sent to me must have been dictated to one of the nurses. Perhaps he had asked one of his comrades to write down your address," I said hesitatingly. "Yes," she reflected. "It must have been like that. My son was so devoted to me. He was not on specially good terms with his father, although he too loved our son as much as I did." So she broke off for a moment and looked around the room. "Forgive me, please, for not offering you anything," she apologized. I should very much like to do so, but you know how things are today. I have nothing in the house and there is very little in the shops. I stood and went over to her son's photograph again. I did not know how to bring the conversation around again to him. Take the photograph down if you like, she suggested. I took it carefully down from the wall and put it on the table. Is that a uniform he's wearing? I asked. Yes, he was 16 at the time and in the Hitler Youth, she replied. My husband didn't like it at all. He was convinced a convinced social democrat, and he had many difficulties because he would not join the party. Now I'm glad he didn't. In all those years, he never got any promotion. He was always passed over. It was always during the war, and he was a last man manager because all the younger men were called up. Only a few weeks later, almost exactly a year from the day on which we received the news about our son's death, the factory was bombed. Many lives were lost, including my husband. In a helpless, despairing gesture, she folded her hands together. So I'm left alone. I live only for the memories of my husband and my son. I might move to my sister's, but I don't want to give up this house. My parents lived here and my son was born here. Everything reminds me of the happy times, and if I went away, I would feel that I was denying the past. As my eyes came to rest on the crucifix which hung on the wall, the old lady noticed my glance. I found that cross in the ruins of the house, she said. It was buried in the rubble, except that one arm was showing, pointing up accusingly at the sky. As nobody seemed to want it, I took it away. I feel a little less abandoned. Had this woman too perhaps thought God was on leave and had returned to the world only when she saw all the ruins? Before I could pursue this train of thought, she went on. What happened to us was punishment from God. My husband said at the time of Hitler's coming to power that it would be something that would end in disaster. So were the prophetic words. I am always thinking about them. One day our boy surprised us with the news that he had joined the Hitler Youth, although I had brought him up on a strictly religious line. You may have noticed the saints' pictures in the room. Most of them I had taken down after 1933. My son asked me to do so. His comrades used to rag him for being crazy about the church. He told me about it reproachfully, as if it were my fault. You know how in those days they set our children against God and their parents. My husband was not a religious man. He rarely went to church because he did not like the priests, but he would allow nothing to be said against our parish priest, for Carl was his favourite. He always made my husband happy to hear the priest praise. The old lady's eyes were filled with tears. She took the photograph in her hand and gazed at it. Her tears fell on the glass. Well, Shabbat Shalom, Mike Fryer.